Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at the Sinaloa Cartel, and we're going to be using this excerpt from their Wikipedia page as a jumping off point. You know, it's a really interesting cartel. I mean, there's so much to it, and I think a lot of people get stuck on just like the El Chapo side of things,
Mhm.
but there's so much more to unpack. And so I'm really excited to have expert speaker here with me today to go through all this stuff. Are you ready to dive in?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this cartel's history is really just a case study, I think, in adaptation and ruthlessness.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like you think you know something about it, and then you start doing a little bit more research, and you're like, "Oh my God, this goes so much deeper than I thought." So let's start with the origins, I guess, in the late 1960s with this guy Pedro Aviles Perez.
Yeah, this guy was a pioneer, really. He was one of the first people to use aircraft to smuggle marijuana across the border.
Wow, using planes back then. That's pretty ahead of his time, huh?
Yeah, and it just laid the groundwork for the large-scale operations that the Sinaloa cartel would eventually become known for. And, you mentioned El Chapo earlier. El Chapo actually got his start in Aviles' organization.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah. So there's a direct line there from the founder to the cartel's most notorious figure.
It's amazing how these early innovations, I guess you could call them, had like a ripple effect and kind of shaped the whole drug trade.
Yeah.
So from there, how do we go from like Aviles to the Guadalajara cartel, which I guess is kind of like the Sinaloa cartel's precursor?
Yeah, well, the Guadalajara cartel was really the brainchild of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and this guy controlled a lot of the major drug trafficking routes in Mexico throughout the 1980s.
Wow.
They even rivaled the Gulf Cartel, which is another infamous cartel. And then in 1987, Gallardo made this decision to kind of divide his federation.
Wait, divided it. Wouldn't that weaken his organization?
That's the thing. It seems counterintuitive, but by splitting it up into smaller, more autonomous cells, he actually made the cartel much more resilient. So it was like a hydra, you know? You cut off one head and two more grow back.
Right.
And this decentralized structure that's kind of a hallmark of the Sinaloa cartel allowed them to survive all the crackdowns and the law enforcement efforts over the years.
So he was basically like giving up some control in the short term to like ensure the long-term survival of the organization.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy smart,
Hmm.
but, obviously evil.
Yeah. You got to give him credit for his strategic thinking. But
Yeah.
yeah, this move really set the stage for the cartel wars that would come later, like the battle for Tijuana.
Right. So we're talking about the Sinaloa cartel versus the Tijuana cartel headed by the Arellano Felix brothers.
Exactly. They were both fighting for control of that key smuggling route into the U.S., and things got really violent.
Yeah.
Like in 1992, there was this attack at a disco in Puerto Vallarta where 8 members of the Tijuana cartel were killed.
Oh my God. That's insane.
And then there was the assassination of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo the same year.
Yeah. What happened there?
He was caught in the crossfire at the Guadalajara airport during what was believed to be a shootout between the two cartels.
Wow. So they were just shooting it out at the airport.
It was a crazy time, and to this day, it's still not clear if the Cardinal was an intended target or if he was just caught in the crossfire.
Man, that's crazy. So how did that rivalry end?
Well, it seems like the Sinaloa cartel either absorbed the Tijuana cartel or forced them into some kind of alliance, because they're not really considered rivals anymore.
Oh, wow. So they basically just like wiped them out?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there was even this former Tijuana cartel lieutenant Eduardo Teodoro Garcia Cimental who ended up allied with Sinaloa, and that definitely helped in the downfall of the Tijuana cartel.
It's insane how they just like absorb or eliminate their competition.
Yeah.
It's really effective, but also terrifying.
So can we talk a little bit more about the Sinaloa cartel structure? Because you mentioned before that it's not really a traditional hierarchy.
Right. It's more like a confederation of semi-autonomous groups, each with their own territory, their own leadership, and even their own specializations. So it's less like a corporation and more like a network of franchises, almost.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's a big part of why they've been so hard to take down, because you can take out one faction, but the others are still going to be operating.
So even with someone like El Chapo gone, they could still function.
Exactly. El Chapo was a powerful figure, obviously, but he wasn't the whole show.
Yeah, he was more like the face of the cartel.
Right. And his capture was a big blow, but it didn't cripple the organization.
So who's running things now?
Well, it's a bit of a power struggle at the moment. You've
Yeah.
got El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos, and then you've got Ismael El Mayo Zambado.
Right, El Mayo, the guy who's never been caught.
Yeah, he's a bit of an enigma, El Mayo. He's been a major player for decades, but he's always kept a low profile.
So he's like the opposite of El Chapo in terms of like public persona.
Yeah, El Chapo was all about the flash, and the notoriety El Mayo is more about strategy and staying under the radar.
So who do you think is going to come out on top in this power struggle?
It's hard to say. They both have their strengths and weaknesses.
Man, it's like a real-life Game of Thrones over there. It's crazy. But let's talk about El Chapo for a second, because he really was a larger-than-life figure. I mean, he was more than just a criminal. He was like a cultural icon.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, I think. We have this tendency to romanticize these criminals. We get caught up in the drama and the intrigue, and we forget about the real human cost of their actions.
That's true. I mean, it's easy to get swept up in the whole like El Chapo mythos, but we have to remember that he was responsible for a lot of violence and suffering.
Exactly. And the same goes for the Sinaloa Cartel as a whole.
Yeah.
They're not just some Robin Hood-esque group. They're a ruthless criminal organization that's responsible for countless deaths and untold misery.
Right, and their reach extends far beyond Mexico.
Oh, absolutely. They have a presence all over the world. They're in the Philippines, they're in Latin America, they're in Canada, they're even in Europe.
Wow. So they're truly a global operation.
Yeah, and that makes them even harder to fight.
And speaking of fighting them, let's talk about those drug super tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border.
Oh, yeah, the tunnels are legendary.
They're crazy. Like, who comes up with this stuff?
Well, the Sinaloa Cartel has a lot of resources and a lot of ingenuity,
Yeah.
and they're willing to go to great lengths to move their product.
Yeah, I mean, the Taj Mahal tunnel that they found near Tijuana Airport back in 1993 was like 1,500 feet long.
Yeah, and it had ventilation and rail tracks and lighting. It was basically an underground highway.
That's insane. It's like something out of a movie.
Right.
But cocaine isn't their only game anymore, right?
No, they've diversified quite a bit. They're into heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, even marijuana,
So they're like a one-stop shop for all your illicit needs.
basically. And that makes them even more dangerous because they're not just relying on one product.
So what's the latest with them? What are they up to these days?
Well, one of the most concerning trends is their shift from heroin to fentanyl.
Fentanyl. That's so super dangerous, right?
It's incredibly potent, and it's responsible for a lot of overdose deaths. And the Sinaloa Cartel is a major player in the fentanyl trade.
So they're basically profiting off of people's misery.
That's one way to put it.
It's really sad. And then there's the whole thing with the multicolored fentanyl. Is that really aimed at kids, like the DEA says?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but the fact that they're even producing fentanyl in these bright colors is disturbing.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to make it look appealing to kids.
Right, and that's just one example of how the Sinaloa Cartel is constantly evolving and adapting their tactics.
Like they're always one step ahead of the game.
Yeah, and that makes them a very formidable opponent.
Okay, so before we move on, we have to address the elephant in the room.
Why?
The allegations of corruption and collusion.
Right.
There have been reports from NPR and other sources that suggest the Sinaloa Cartel might have ties to Mexican authorities, even potentially reaching into the military.
These are serious allegations, and if they're true, it would mean that the cartel has infiltrated the very institutions that are supposed to be fighting them.
That's a scary thought.
It is, and it just goes to show how deeply entrenched this organization is.
Yeah, this is some heavy stuff. I need to take a break for a second.
Yeah, me too. Makes you wonder, how do you even begin to dismantle an organization that's like so deeply embedded?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question.
Mm-hmm.
And, to even try to answer it, I think we need to go even deeper into their structure. You were saying before that it's kind of like this network of franchises, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how does that actually work, like day to day?
Well, it's kind of this balancing act, between cooperation and competition. These different factions, they might be united under the Sinaloa banner, but they also have their own interests, their own ambitions.
Right.
So, they might work together on big shipments or share resources, but they can also be rivals, clashing over territory or profits.
It's just like this constant power struggle going on within the cartel.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where figures like El Mayo Zambada come in. He's been around for decades, and he's known for his ability to kind of navigate those internal dynamics.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that some people even consider him to be the true mastermind behind the cartel.
Mm-hmm.
What makes him so different from El Chapo?
I think El Chapo really cultivated that flamboyant persona, right? Always in the headlines. But El Mayo, he's much more discreet. He's a master of staying under the radar, building alliances, playing the long game.
And he's never been caught, right?
Never been caught, which just adds to the mystique.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that saying, right? The quiet ones are the ones you got to watch out for. But with all these different factions, all these different personalities, how do they keep things from just completely falling apart?
Well, they have their own ways of resolving disputes.
Yeah.
You could call it a cartel court, I guess. And they also have a very strict code of conduct.
So it's like their own twisted version of law and order.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's actually pretty effective, in terms of maintaining some kind of stability within the organization.
So they can kind of keep their internal house in order
Right.
while they're out there, wreaking havoc on the world.
Exactly. And that stability, it allows them to function on a global scale.
Hmm.
We talked about their presence in the Philippines, but they're so much bigger than that.
Yeah, I mean, their operations span multiple continents, from Latin America to Canada, even Europe.
And they're very good at infiltrating legitimate businesses,
Yeah.
using them for money laundering and smuggling operations.
Oh, so they're not just like this separate criminal entity. They're actually woven into the fabric of society.
Right. And they've corrupted officials at all levels, to secure protection and look the other way.
Man, it's like they're playing 4D chess out here,
Yeah.
while the rest of us are struggling with checkers.
Yeah. And they're always adapting, embracing new technologies.
So speaking of technology, we talked about the tunnels,
Yeah.
but they're also using the dark web, right?
Oh, yeah. The dark web is a huge part of their operations now. They use it to traffic drugs, weapons, even people.
Mm.
And they're really good at it.
So they're not just thugs with guns. They're like tech-savvy criminals.
Exactly. And that makes them even more dangerous because
Mhm.
it's harder to track them down, harder to stop them.
Especially with this whole shift towards fentanyl. I mean, the potency of that drug is just terrifying. And it's so accessible now.
It's a huge problem. And the Sinaloa Cartel is one of the main suppliers of fentanyl. It's cheap to produce, highly addictive, and incredibly profitable for them. So it's a win-win in their eyes.
It's just sad.
Yeah.
They're profiting off of people's misery. And then you add in the corruption allegations, and it's just like, who can you even trust to fight this?
Yeah. If the reports are true and the cartel really has infiltrated government and law enforcement agencies, that's a huge problem. It erodes public trust, it creates this climate of impunity, and it makes it so much harder to hold these criminals accountable.
Yeah, this is some heavy stuff. It's not just about stopping a few bad guys. This is about systemic change.
It is, and it's a long and difficult road ahead, but we can't give up. The stakes are too high. The Sinaloa Cartel, their operations fuel violence and corruption and suffering all over the world. We have a responsibility to fight back.
And part of that fight has to be about changing the narrative, right? We have to stop romanticizing these criminals. We have to see them for what they are, ruthless predators who are destroying lives for profit.
Exactly. We need to focus on the victims, the communities that have been torn apart by the cartel's violence, the people whose lives have been ruined by addiction. We need to humanize this issue.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the cartel's origins, their organizational structure, their global reach, their evolution into this multifaceted criminal enterprise. What does the future hold? What should we be watching out for?
I think one of the most concerning trends is their increasing involvement in cybercrime. They're using the dark web to expand their operations, trafficking everything from drugs and weapons to stolen data and even people.
So they're taking their business online.
Yeah, exactly. And their technical capabilities are getting more sophisticated all the time. They're launching ransomware attacks, hacking into financial institutions, recruiting hackers.
So they're not just adapting to the digital age, they're weaponizing it.
Exactly. And that makes them even harder to fight because now they're operating in this space where traditional law enforcement tactics don't always apply.
What else should we be on the lookout for?
Their growing influence in politics. They're bribing officials, funding campaigns, even resorting to violence to intimidate their opponents.
So it's not just about controlling the drug trade anymore. It's about controlling governments.
Exactly. They want to influence policies, protect their interests, ensure their survival.
It's like they're becoming a shadow government.
It's a scary thought, but it's the reality we're facing. And we need to be aware of the threat. We need to hold our leaders accountable. We need to demand transparency and action.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I mean, we've gone from humble beginnings to global empire, from marijuana smuggling to a diversified criminal portfolio that includes cybercrime and political manipulation. It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's important to understand the complexity of the problem, because only then can we start to find solutions.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, how do you even, begin to dismantle something like that?
Yeah, I mean, is it even possible to, win this fight? They've been around for so long, they just adapt to everything.
I think it's less about, searching for one big victory and more about just constantly chipping away at them, disrupting their operations, making it harder for them to do business.
Okay, so where do we even start?
I think international cooperation is key, you know? The cartel doesn't respect borders, so we can't either.
Right.
We need to be sharing intelligence, coordinating law enforcement efforts, across countries.
But isn't that really hard to do, like getting all these different countries to work together?
It's definitely a challenge, but the alternative is to just let them continue to exploit those gaps, you know?
Right.
And then on top of that, we got to address the demand side of things too.
Right, like as long as people want drugs, someone's going to be there to sell them to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to look at the root causes of addiction, poverty, lack of opportunity, mental health issues, trauma, all that stuff.
So it's not just a law enforcement problem, it's a societal problem.
Right. And we need to invest in prevention and treatment and harm reduction strategies.
And we can't forget about the corruption either. I mean, that's a huge part of the problem.
Absolutely. Corruption allows these organizations to thrive, so we need more transparency and accountability in governments and law enforcement agencies.
Right, like protect whistleblowers,
Yeah.
strengthen judicial systems, all that stuff.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where corruption just isn't tolerated.
But that's a huge undertaking, right?
It is. It's a long road, but it's the only way to make real progress.
So it's not just about taking down the Sinaloa cartel, it's about changing the whole system.
Yeah, it's about creating a world where these kinds of organizations just can't exist, where the risks outweigh the rewards.
Wow. This has been a really intense deep dive. I mean, we've covered so much ground, from like the cartel's humble beginnings to this global empire they've built, and from simple marijuana smuggling to like cybercrime and political manipulation.
It's amazing how much they've evolved and adapted over the years.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
For me, it's that this fight is never really over.
Yeah.
The Sinaloa Cartel is just one example of the challenges we face when it comes to organized crime. And they're constantly evolving. They're always finding new ways to exploit the system.
So we can't get complacent.
Yeah.
We have to be vigilant.
Right. We have to be proactive, not reactive. And we have to be willing to adapt our strategies as the threat changes.
And we can't forget about the human cost of all of this either.
Yeah.
The violence, the addiction, the corruption, it's all connected.
Right. There are real people who are suffering because of the cartel's actions, and we can't lose sight of that.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, and I hope it's encouraged our listeners to learn more about this issue and to get involved in the fight against organized crime, because it's a fight that affects us all.
It does. It's a global problem that requires global solutions, and it's a fight that we can't afford to lose.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, and as always, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious.